Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, hope you've all been doing well. In this video, we'll be taking a look at AMD's all-new Ryzen 9 3900X processor, which they released last month. I wanted to make this video a few weeks ago, but only got around to doing it now due to various reasons, such as not having enough time on my hands, and also due to seeing some early issues in regards to Windows behavior and BIOS issues. I decided to hold off for a bit. Initially, I had gotten all my parts before the 7th of July, and the only thing that was left was the processor. However, there was a bit of a delay here in Canada, so I never got my processor on launch day. But now with everything all said and done, I've got my 3900X system all up and running, and have conducted a whole bunch of benchmarks which I'll be showing you guys. Now before we get into the benchmarks, I'll be going through the system specifications with you guys and some details of the components themselves. I won't be doing a whole overview of what's new with the Ryzen 3rd Gen or the Zen 2 architecture, as I've already discussed those details in previous videos, and with the processors being out now on the market for about a month, I'm sure most of you guys have already done your reading on that anyways. Starting off with the 3900X, this is the 12-core 24-thread CPU in the 3rd Gen lineup, with a base clock of 3.6 GHz and a boost clock of up to 4.6 GHz. It's got a whopping 64 megabytes of L3 cache, which AMD are calling game cache these days, and 6 megabytes of L2 cache. Based on TSMC's 7nm FinFET process, so a smaller node than what their previous mainstream chips were based on, and due to the smaller node, the CPU has a default TDP of 105 watts. Cooling the CPU is a good old Noctua NHD15 dual tower air cooler, and I'm also using Noctua's latest NT-H2 paste. For the motherboard, I'm using Gigabyte's all-new X570 Aorus Master, a board that's pretty much loaded with all the bells and whistles. High memory overclocking support, a true 14-phase VRM layout, 3 M.2 slots, and of course new with this generation is the support for PCI Express 4, along with onboard Wi-Fi 6 or AX. The memory I've paired with the 3900X is 16GB of G.Skill's Trident Z, clocked at 3600 MHz with CL14 tuned primary timings at some timings. On the 3900X, I've also made sure to set up a 1:1:1 ratio where the memory clock equals the memory controller clock to the Infinity Fabric clock, to minimize latency as much as possible. The graphics card I'll be using for my testing will be the EVGA GTX 1080 Ti SC Black Edition, which has a plus 100 MHz offset to the core and plus 300 MHz offset to the memory. For the power supply, we've got an EVGA SuperNOVA G2 750W gold rated unit, and housing all the components, I've got a Corsair Air 740 with all the fan mounts populated, providing ample amount of airflow to keep all of our components nice and cool. In terms of software, I'm running Windows 10 Pro 1903 with the Ryzen Balanced Power Plant enabled. In regards to drivers, I was using AMD's latest chipset drivers released on July 31st, 2019, and Nvidia's 431.36 Wiggle drivers for the video card. The F5i BIOS version was used for the motherboard, which has the AGIZA 1003 ABB microcode update. In the benchmarks, I've also thrown in my old 1800X, which is the CPU I'm upgrading from. I did this because I wanted to show you guys the difference between the first generation flagship CPU, which was released at $499, and the current generation Ryzen 3rd Gen CPU, which was also launched at $499. We'll be able to see how much of a performance boost one can expect in various scenarios if they're coming from a previous generation Ryzen 8 core CPU. The other reason was because I don't have a plethora of hardware like other reviewers, so just to make things more interesting and have more data to analyze, this will be helpful in that regard, rather than me just showing you guys one CPU. So for the 1800X, the system specs were also the same, except I was using the Gigabyte AX370 Gaming 5 motherboard with 16GB of G.Skill Trident Z memory clocked at 3333 MHz with CL-tuned timings. Now, before you wonder why I didn't pair the 1800X with the same 3600 MHz kit, or why I didn't run slower RAM on the 3900X, this is because I also want to show you guys what you can achieve with the whole platform upgrade. Sure, I could have normalized the memory for both systems, but with the 3rd gen, AMD have emphasized their support for higher frequency memory, and I want to be able to show you guys the overall improvements with faster RAM included. Both processors were tested with their stock configurations, and in terms of overclocking, the 1800X had a 4.0 GHz all-core overclock, and for the 3900X, Precision Boost Overdrive was used with Auto OC. I didn't bother messing around with an all-core overclock for the 3900X because I tried configuring it with a 4.4 GHz all-core overclock, but it wasn't really attainable with reasonable voltages, and I didn't want to back it down to a lower frequency and sacrifice on single core performance. Therefore, I said, you know what, I'll leave it alone, let PBO and Auto OC work their magic. So now that all the test system specs are all out of the way, it's time we jumped into the benchmarks. We'll start things off by taking a look at some CPU benchmarks, and first up we have Maxon's Cinebench R20 benchmark, a very popular industry-wide CPU benchmark that makes the processors render an image using path tracing. Here you guys see I've added both the multi-core and single-core results, as they're both very important metrics that can tell you a lot about a CPU's performance in various applications. And I've done this for most of the benchmarks that would allow me to choose both the single and multi-core options. In this particular benchmark, we can see quite an improvement in both the multi and single core results when comparing the 3900X and the 1800X. The stock 3900X was almost 100% faster than the stock 1800X and was 83% faster than the overclocked 1800X. Now with PBO enabled, the 3900X increased its score by a mere 1.6%, so not much at all. Still, the stock performance of the 3900X was already amazing as it is. In terms of single core improvements, here we're also seeing some good gains with the stock 3900X. It's 38% faster than the stock 1800X and is 28% faster than the overclocked 1800X. A remarkable improvement for the single core as well, an area that AMD really needed to improve on. Again, like the multi-core score, PBO did basically nothing for the 3900X. Not sure if this is because that stock the 3900X was already doing a good enough job to hit its max potential, or if PBO is still somewhat buggy with these early BIOS updates. Now the next benchmark we'll be looking at is Cinebench R15, and I threw this in here because Cinebench R20 only recently came out earlier this year, and for a while now R15 was the standard go-to CPU benchmark that everyone had been using. Just like with Cinebench R20, we're looking at similar margins here when comparing figures from both CPUs. The stock 3900X almost doubles the stock 1800X's score and is around 81% faster than the overclocked 1800X. While the 3900X with PBO enabled increases the score by a mere 2%, single core scores have also been improved by similar margins. The stock 3900X is around 34% faster than the stock 1800X and is 31% faster than the overclocked 1800X, so pretty good improvements all around. Moving on, we have CPU-Z, and here the 3900X is also showing some impressive numbers. Boasting a multi-threaded score of 8459, this puts it at 83% faster than the stock 1800X. When comparing the overclocked scores, we're looking at a difference of around 70%. In regards to the single-core score, the stock 3900X benches 112 points higher, and the overclocked 3900X scores 85 points higher, or is 19% faster. Geekbench 4 is a popular benchmark that is used on a variety of devices to gauge performance, and so I thought it was only natural to include it in my benchmark suite. This benchmark makes the CPU go through a variety of tests from integer, cryptography, floating point, and memory tasks. The 3900X in this benchmark scores 50,001 for the multi-threaded score, and scores 5953 for the single-threaded score. When comparing that to the stock 1800X, we're looking at an improvement of around 77% and 28% for the multi-threaded and single-threaded results respectively. Overclocked, and the 1800X cuts the multi-threaded gap to around 70%, and the single-core results come down to a difference of 24%. While the improvements in multi-threaded are pretty much a given due to 50% more cores, I'm pretty happy to see the considerable increases in these single-threaded results, and you guys can see how that translates to real-world performance later on. VRay is next, and this is another ray tracer benchmark similar to Cinebench, where the CPU is instructed to render out an image, and the score yielded here is in points per second. The stock 3900X attains 6370 for the multi-threaded score, and with PBO, the score improved about a percent to 6427. Meanwhile, the single-threaded results here are pretty much within margin of error. When comparing that to the stock 1800X, we can see an improvement of 88% for the multi-threaded results, and about 34% for the single-threaded results. Then when overclocked, the gap closes here at 75% and 23% for the multi and single-threaded results respectively. Corona is another benchmark that renders out an image, and the final results show how long the image took to render, and also displays the rays per second. First up, we'll be taking a look at how long it took each configuration to complete the render. The 1800X at stock took 130 seconds to render the image, and when overclocked, that cut the time down by 9 seconds at just 121. Then when moving on to the 12-core 3900X, we drastically reduced the time to just 69 seconds, and with PBO enabled, it shaves off just 1 second off the time. When looking at rays per second, we can see that the 3900X is 88% faster than the stock 1800X, and is 76% faster than the overclocked 1800X. VRay is another similar benchmark where an image is rendered out, and at the end the program spits out a score telling you how well the processor did. The 3900X had an impressive score of 20,793, and with PBO enabled, it allowed it to increase that score by 425 points, bringing that up to 21,218. When comparing that to the 1800X, we're looking at almost double the performance. Like I said before, seeing these kinds of differences in these programs is pretty much a given due to the increase in cores, increase in frequency, and the uplift in IPC. The last synthetic CPU benchmark we'll be taking a look at is W prime, where in this benchmark the CPU will be calculating prime numbers. Comparing the stock 3900X to the 1800X, we see a significant reduction in the time it took to complete the calculation, almost half where the 1800X took 103 seconds to complete. The 3900X took 56 seconds to complete. Just like how we saw with the Corona benchmark, PBO did basically nothing for us. We're looking at a 1 second difference here, so you might as well just call that a tie. Now it's time we shifted our focus to some real-world applications, and up first, we'll be taking a look at Vegas Pro 15, a very popular video editing software. For this benchmark, what I did was that I took a short game clip that was a minute and 30 seconds long, rendered it out using the Magix AVC format, and used the 4K 60fps preset with GPU acceleration off because I'm trying to see the difference here for the CPUs. As for the results, we're seeing a decent improvement here. Going from a stock 1800X to a stock 3900X yielded a difference of 238 seconds, or an improvement of 76%. And when comparing that to the overclocked 1800X, the gap closes to a 62% reduction in time, but that's still a significant difference there. And keep in mind, this was just a short clip. With larger sized video files with multiple effects, color correction, so on and so forth, the difference can be larger. Again, PBO not really doing much for the 3900X, shaving off just 4 seconds for our render time. Up next, we'll be taking a look at 7-Zip, a file compression and decompression software which many use on a daily basis. For this test, we used the built-in benchmark tool to help us gauge the performance for each of the configurations, as it measures the integer instruction rate, or MIPS, using a zip algorithm. Ryzen was already known for having great decompression capabilities, and the 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs improve on that quite significantly. The 3900X was measured at 141,974 MIPS, where the stock 1800X was measured at 76,318. Now, in terms of compression, performance in this area had been previously noted as lacking for the Ryzen CPUs. It wasn't as important since most people are decompressing files rather than doing compression, but it does look like AMD have made quite the strides here as well. 102,819 MIPS is what I achieved for the stock 3900X, and 109,876 is what the score increased to with PBO enabled. Comparing that to the 1800X, and we're looking at pretty much double the performance there. Emulation is a huge part of the gaming world, where on PC, many users can download emulators to revisit some of their favorite console classics from back in the day. For this benchmark, I used the popular Dolphin Wii and GameCube emulator. This is a really important test. I wanted to throw in my benchmark suite because AMD was significantly behind in this area. Emulation is a task that does require a fast processor, but not necessarily in terms of core count. Emulators generally like a processor with strong single-core performance instead. The benchmark is posted on the Dolphin EMU forums for anyone to download and try out on their system. As shown here by the Google Docs spreadsheet result, Intel is primarily dominant here, but I'm expecting things to change here. Looking at the results, and there is a significant reduction in completion time when comparing the two processors. 507 seconds for the stock 1800X, and 331 seconds for the 3900X, which is excellent. This benchmark highlights the single-core improvements AMD have made on the 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs. Overclocking the 1800X does give it a nice boost, but it still isn't that competitive with the faster Intel CPUs in the benchmark. With the 3900X, it does look like they have closed the gap quite a bit. The last application we'll be taking a look at before we move on to the next section is Blender. Blender is a free and open source 3D computer graphics software toolset used for creating animated films, visual effects, and art. For this benchmark, I decided to use the popular BMW scene as it's most commonly used and will give you guys a good perspective on the results here. The stock 1800X here took 290 seconds to complete the render, and when overclocked, boosted its time to 269 seconds. The 3900X at stock completes the render in just 154 seconds, and with PBO enabled, reduces that time by only 2 seconds. So pretty good improvements all around for this upgrade. Now moving on to the fun part of the video, the gaming benchmarks. First off, we'll be taking a look at a couple of 3D synthetics before we move on to the actual games. 3D Mark is the standard go-to for these types of benchmarks, and here I've decided to show you guys the physics scores or the CPU scores. For Firestrike Ultra, the 3900X scores a whopping 29,947, and with PBO enabled, it allows us to just break the 30k mark. Very impressive, and comparing that to the 1800X, we're looking at an improvement of 50% and 37% for the stock and overclocked configurations respectively. TimeSpy Extreme is a similar benchmark, but this one utilizes the newer DirectX 12 API, which is designed to leverage higher-end hardware as much as possible. Here, the stock 3900X has doubled the stock score of the 1800X, while comparing the PBO score to the overclocked 1800X, we're looking at a difference of around 87%. Of course, these are synthetics at the end of the day, which do a good job at scaling multiple threads, and shouldn't be used to reflect real-world performance. So speaking of real-world performance, let's take a look at our first game, and that is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, running at 1080p with the high preset on the DirectX 12 API. Post-processing effects like motion blur were disabled, and any sorts of caps like VSync were also off for obvious reasons. I decided to use these settings for pretty much all my titles, as they'll do a good job at reflecting a real-world scenario without really incurring a GPU bottleneck. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is the third installment into the Tomb Raider reboot franchise, and this game does a pretty good job at leveraging CPU power. The 3900X in this title is 38% faster than the stock 1800X, and is 28% faster when the 1800X is overclocked in terms of the average frame rate. Our 1% frame time results also showed a significant improvement as well. We're looking at an improvement of around 55%. This allows the game to run buttery smooth, and the overall experience will be fantastic. Interestingly, we see a slight performance regression with the 3900X using PBO for the average frame rate, but our 1% and 0.1% results show an opposite effect, where they improve by around 9% and 18% respectively. Moving on, we'll be taking a look at Far Cry 5, and in this title, the 3900X is showing some good gains in regards to the average frame rate over the 1800X. A difference of around 26% between the stock configurations and 18% for the overclocked configurations. The 1% lows have also improved by a decent margin as well, 25% and 17% for the stock and overclocked configurations respectively. So overall, good improvements all around. The 3900X is showing some great performance with this title. Grand Theft Auto 5 is one of the older titles in this list, but I still wanted to include it because it's still very popular. In GTA 5, a strong CPU can make a significant difference, but this game doesn't necessarily scale well with lots of threads, but rather single-core performance can play a huge role in regards to having an impact. GTA 5 shows us a difference of around 34% between the stock 1800X and 3900X for the average frame rate. Comparing the overclocked configurations, and that margin is down to 28%. The 1% lows are also noticeably better on the 3900X, where we're still above 90 FPS, whereas the 1800X is around 38% slower there. Middle-earth Shadow of War is next, and this game is already pretty well optimized, where regardless of either configuration, the gaming experience here was absolutely fantastic, with a fairly high frame rate achieved on both systems. With that said, the 3900X in this title is only just 13% faster than the 1800X. With PBO, the 3900X doesn't really offer any better performance, while the 1800X closes the gap a bit, reducing that margin to just 9%. We see a much bigger impact on the 1% and 0.1% lows, where the 3900X offers significantly better results there, showing a difference of around 25% and 27% respectively. Due to that, the overall gameplay will be quite a bit smoother, as we're looking at much better consistency. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is a very demanding title and does scale with multiple threads. Now, while the average frame rate across the board looks to be very similar with no noticeable changes, it's the 1% and 0.1% lows here which look much better on the 3900X. The 50% more cores and threads allow for much smoother gameplay, whereas the 1800X, there were some very noticeable stutters that would occur every now and again. For Honor is a strategic combat game also from Ubisoft, and this game, just like with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, shows some similar behavior. Now, while both processors can deliver a great playable experience with average frame rates well north of 200 FPS, it's the 0.1% lows which are again a lot better on the 3900X as opposed to the 1800X. The result for the 1800X isn't horrible, but when looking at the consistency, the 3900X is just on point here, with lows at 174 stock and 176 with PBO on. Regardless, anyone who plays this game on a high refresh rate monitor will absolutely love it. Up next on our list is Ghost Recon Wildlands. Now this game doesn't show any major differences when looking at both the CPUs. In regards to the average frame rate, 1% lows and 0.1% lows, not much has changed. We're really looking at margin of error stuff. If anything, this tells us that the game would rather care more about the GPU than the CPU. So let's move on. Battlefield 1 was 2016's popular first-person shooter title, and late last year, EA released Battlefield 5, which I wasn't really interested in getting, so that's why it's not on my list. I still wanted to include something from the franchise, so I thought BF1 would be better than nothing. It looks like the 3900X was hitting the game's built-in frame cap, while the 1800X still puts up some good numbers. The difference between the stock 3900X and stock 1800X for the 1% and 0.1% lows was 27% and a whopping 71% respectively. Meanwhile, for the overclocked configurations, we're looking at a difference of around 17% and 36% for the 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. A decent improvement when jumping from the 1800X to the 3900X, but that's not to say that the 1800X was slow or anything like that. Gears of War 4 is another title which was released back in 2016, and we'll be getting a newer installment next month. But since GAL 5 isn't technically out, I included this one instead. Running on the DirectX 12 API, this game was pretty well optimized and ran great on a lot of hardware I've tested. Having a more powerful CPU than the 1800X can still allow the game to leverage that hardware gain for more performance as evident here. The difference between the stock 1800X and stock 3900X is 39 FPS, or 28%, and the 1% and 0.1% lows also show some really good gains at 67% and 79% respectively. Like previously looked at titles, it seems as though having as many threads as possible can really help smooth out the frame time results. Granted, the latencies don't change much. Also, having the higher headroom for memory overclocking, I'm sure is also playing a role here. I always like to throw in a few racing games into my benchmarks, so first up we'll be taking a look at Forza Horizon 4, a beautiful open world title that takes place in the United Kingdom. This game is pretty well optimized and runs great considering how amazing everything looks. The stock 3900X in this title is 20% faster than the 1800X at stock when looking at the average frame rates. The frame time results are also considerably better, with differences noted at 29% and 18% for the 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. We do see a decent bump for the minimums when the 1800X is overclocked, and when comparing that to the 3900X, we're looking at a difference of around 16% and just 8% for the 1% and 0.1% lows. The second racing title we'll be looking at is Project Cars 2. In this title, what we see here is that with the 3900X, the average frame rate increases by 15% and 11% when looking at the stock and overclocked configurations respectively. However, our 1% and 0.1% lows don't really change that much between all the configurations. It's pretty much margin of error stuff. F1 2018 is the last racing game on the list, and here we can see a somewhat similar behavior as we did in Project Cars 2 when looking at the average frame rate. The 3900X takes a lead over the 1800X. However, what's different is that our 1% and 0.1% lows have actually regressed. Here, the stock 1800X's 1% and 0.1% lows are 8% and 9% higher than the stock 3900X respectively. You'll see that this is the worst case scenario for our 3900X. Not sure what might be causing it to perform a little worse than the older gen Ryzen in that regard, but maybe it's because this game just doesn't like the separate chiplets, or maybe it's because it's an optimization issue, who knows. Moving away from the racing games, we have an MMORPG next on our list, and one of my personal favorites, The Elder Scrolls Online. I've talked about this game many times in the past, and it's still my go-to when I'm feeling in the mood for some MMO action. Now, ZeniMax have stated in the past how they have pushed out updates that will help users with higher core count CPUs to better leverage their hardware, but I find that it's still fundamentally reliant on a single core. And this game is actually so CPU bound that you could run it at 4K with max settings, and you would still find your GPU barely being utilized. I remember back when I had upgraded to the 1800X from the 6600K, this game actually ran worse due to the lower single core performance. So with the 3900X's stronger single core performance, we're seeing a noticeable boost in performance. My testing area consisted of going through the entire city of Wayrest and Stormhaven, which is a very busy city that's usually packed with a lot of players. Our runs show us that 3900X is 37% faster than the stock 1800X when looking at the average frame rate. In terms of the 1% and 0.1% lows, we see an increase of 17%, and with PBO enabled, we see a decent boost as well for the 3900X, 12% and 22% for the 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. Really happy about the performance boost here because I love to see all the performance you can get with this title. Civilization 6 is next on our list. I like to include as many titles as possible from various genres, so I couldn't forget about a top-down real-time strategy game. Here I didn't measure FPS because, to be quite frank with you, this title can push high frame rates with lots of hardware in terms of graphics and all that. What truly matters here is the AI turn time. Although it looks like with this game, regardless of either configuration, performance appears to be pretty similar, so really no noticeable changes here. The Witcher 3 is pretty much a staple in any benchmark suite. This is a fantastic open world RPG that looks stunning and from a tech standpoint is impressive because it scales really well with hardware. My test consisted of riding through the city of Novigrad, as it's quite a demanding area with lots of structures and NPCs. Our runs show us that the minimums don't really change that much, however the average frame rate increases substantially over the 1800X. When comparing the stock configurations, we're seeing a difference of around 17%, and for the overclocked configurations the difference is around the same margin. Moving on, we'll be taking a look at some popular Twitch shooters, and first up is the popular first-person MOBA, Overwatch. If you're an individual who plays on a high refresh rate monitor, then you'll be very pleased with the results from the 3900X. Now, while both processors are showing frame rates in the 200s for the average results, the 3900X is noticeably better than the 1800X when looking at the 1% and 0.1% lows. The difference between the stock 1% minimum is 23%, and for the 0.1% lows, it is around 36%, which makes the overall gameplay quite a bit smoother. Counter-Strike Global Offensive is next, and this title just absolutely loves the new 3rd gen Ryzen CPU and the Zen 2 architecture. CSGO shows an absolute massive increase in performance when looking at the average frame rates for the 3900X and the 1800X. Between the stock configurations, the difference is 249 FPS or a whopping 69%. Nice. Overclocking the 1800X does give it a bit of a boost, but it's still nowhere near what the 3900X can deliver. Our 1% and 0.1% lows also show a considerable boost in performance, and in this title, the more FPS, the better. Apex Legends is the last game left on our list, and this game doesn't really show us any noticeable differences between the two CPUs in regards to all three measured stats. Regardless, the numbers here are still great, and you'd have no issues attaining a fun experience with either config. So after going through all the games separately, it's time we looked at the 17 game average, with Civ 6 omitted since we measured time there and not FPS. Comparing the 3900X to the 1800X, we can see that overall, it's a pretty good improvement. The differences in regards to the average frame rate is around 24%, and for the 1% and 0.1% lows, we're looking at a change of around 19% and 33% respectively. When comparing the overclocked configurations, the 1800X does catch up a bit, but the 3900X still holds a considerable lead. 18% for the average frame rate, 14% and 24% for the 1% and 0.1% lows. So overall, many games will run much more consistent due to the better minimums, resulting in smoother gameplay, and then not to mention the average overall higher frame rate. The last bit of data we'll be looking at will have to do with thermals and power consumption. Starting off with the former, we can see that at idle, the 3900X does run a tad bit hotter than the 1800X. Now, if you've been looking at some of the ongoing issues with 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs, there have been some reports that even at idle, voltages will just, for some reason, change sporadically. I was using hardware info to monitor this data, and the voltages would range anywhere from 0.9 volts to spikes just north of 1.5 volts. Under load, the 3900X does run quite a bit hotter than the stock 1800X, but this is pretty much a given considering we're looking at 3 chiplets packed into this AM4 package, so there's going to be a lot of heat density. When it comes to power consumption figures, honestly I was very impressed with what I saw. At idle, the 3900X does consume lower power than the 1800X, and when under load, it was also more power efficient. That 7nm FinFET node really helped bring that power envelope down, and this is primarily why we're able to use such high core count CPUs on a mainstream platform. Now finally, after showing you guys all of this data and analyzing it, it's time I gave you guys my thoughts on how I felt about this upgrade and whether or not I recommend it. If you want my short answer, then yes, I totally recommend it. But I just don't want to leave it at a yes or no and would like to go deeper than just that. When looking at some of the production software benchmarks and other CPU benchmarks, we saw that the 3900X was significantly faster than the 1800X, in some cases almost double. And that's really mind-blowing to me because a couple of years ago, AMD had made this leap with 1st gen Ryzen, where we saw what it was like to have 8 cores on a mainstream platform that was previously only available on the high-end desktop segment. With their 3rd gen Ryzen CPUs, on 7nm, AMD have made another leap yet again. We've gone beyond 8 cores and they've released a processor that's comparable, if not better than the 12-core Threadripper, all on the mainstream platform. So if you're someone who works with a lot of content creation software, video editing, CAD software, you're streaming, you've got virtual machines going on, and you want to be able to blaze through all your projects as fast as possible, then an upgrade to the 3rd gen 12 or even the upcoming 16 core processor would be a 100% recommendation from me. What's really nice too is that while I did upgrade a bunch of other parts along with the 3900X like my motherboard, RAM, and NVMe drive, I didn't actually have to do that. I simply could have taken out my 1800X from my old motherboard, just dropped in a new 12 core part and called it a day. That would have made the upgrade a lot more feasible and cost effective too, looking at it from a financial standpoint. I just had the headroom to do so, and I really wanted to play around with the X570 master board. Now shifting our focus to the gaming side of things, it's actually difficult for me to recommend the 3900X if all you're going to be doing is just gaming with a few extra things on the side. While we did see an improvement across many titles, some which showed massive gains, you also have to realize that these same results could have also been attained with much cheaper 3rd gen parts like the 3600 or 3700X. Obviously, I wouldn't want to compromise anything when doing a quote-unquote upgrade, so to at least keep the same core and thread count, I'd switch to a 3700X if I was primarily just gaming with my computer. That would have allowed me to get a boost in single-core performance, while our multi-threaded performance would also increase by a considerable amount as well. Then you could spend that money saved on much better memory or a GPU upgrade, where you'd probably see more noticeable changes when it comes to gaming. It's not to say that I'm not happy or impressed with the 3900X's gaming performance, but there are cheaper alternatives if gaming is your main intention with your build. Though overall, I'm still very satisfied with my 3900X. I know I'll be having a lot of fun with this upgrade, and will make a lot of content with it, and plan on using it for a very long time. So with that said, stay tuned, get subscribed, because I will be making a lot more videos surrounding the 3900X, and you guys definitely wouldn't want to miss that. I hope you guys found this video to be helpful and informative. Leave your thoughts down below in the comment section. Check out the video description for my other videos and ways to support the channel, along with all the parts you guys saw in the video if you're interested in buying them. Take care guys, and I'll see you guys in the next one.